the big fight going on right now is the same one that's been happening since the start of the conference. It's just to get a little bit scarier. Which countries are really going to stand up for ecological limits and keeping that core part of this current climate convention intact?
The integrity.
The ecological integrity of it. I mean, we're here to set ecological limits on the global economy. That's what the convention says is its goal is to avoid dangerous climate change. Now, to do that, governments need to set a limit on how many greenhouse gases they're going to allow globally, and then use that science-based target and work downward to decide which countries will cut how much gases by when, and to do that equitably. But what's in play right now is the U.S. is proposing a new paradigm. They're calling it a new approach, which is the opposite of setting ecological limits and having science guide you. What they're proposing is that countries just pledge. They make voluntary pledges and say what they're feeling like doing, whatever their Congress is going to let them do, whatever their industry is going to let them do, and that even if that doesn't add up to what science says needs to happen in terms of emission cuts, that's what the deal is going to be. This is their new paradigm. It's called pledge and review. They'll make a pledge, and then in a few years they'll review it and see if it does the job. So this is really failure of the convention's objective, which is to prevent dangerous climate change. The other big issue is the way the U.S. wants to arrange this is they want sort of two columns of countries that are making these pledges, and one are the most polluting developed countries, and called the Annex 1 countries, and the others are called the non-Annex 1 countries. But the U.S. wants both to be listed side by side with making commitments for pledges. And what developing countries are afraid of is that this actually creates a parallel structure where they have to take similar actions and commitments that the most polluting countries, who are most responsible for the problem, will also be taking. So it's not an equitable outcome. It's not sort of according to the established equity principles that governments agreed to 18 years ago. So what we have at risk right now is both the ecological integrity and the equity principles of this current convention. One of the things we just learned in the talks this evening was that the U.S. has now taken a new hostage and raised the ransom in these negotiations, and that's the technology transfer, which has been a core part of the convention for 18 years. How do you help developing countries access the clean energy technology so that they can transition out of fossil fuels or increase access to clean energy for the billions of people, poor countries and poor communities around the world? So this has been a core part of any deal, and governments have worked hard in a set of negotiations, and coming into Cancun are very close to something, and they continue to get even closer to things. And a few of the issues that they decided they can't resolve right here. Now this evening the U.S. just declared that it has to have new language in the agreement that allows them to not only defer the decision till later, but actually wait and see if they get the other pieces of their package. Basically, if they get other developing countries to make new commitments under some new arrangement, then they will then they might consider making this technology transfer mechanism a reality. So this is the kind of behavior that has been going on for too long, and it's why developing countries don't have the level of trust in the negotiations that's needed for such tricky negotiations. The U.S. strategy, of course, has been to block, and then blame countries like Bolivia. So the U.S. will block a new technology mechanism from being established, or block the inclusion of intellectual property rights from being considered, or block the establishment of a UN Global Climate Fund that's not under the World Bank but under the COP. And then it'll blame other countries for not giving in on making actions for mitigation or other new commitments on international reporting of their emissions. and this is how the U.S. manages to get away with it. So it's and what they manage to get away with it because the media doesn't seem to ask them the tough questions and lets them somehow slip away and not be really the international rogue in the climate negotiations that they are. Now maybe it's just too obvious. It's like a fish in water, and everybody always knows this. But somehow the U.S. is able to get the story in the paper, on the radio, and the television that it's China who's blocking, that it's Bolivia who's blocking, and that's not the case. And we see it again here, where the U.S. with this aggressive language, literally saying things like, "I need to have my option. I need to have this, or it's no deal." And that's sort of where we are with 2 days left in this conference. Without a renewed commitment period under the Kyoto Protocol, which the U.S. is not a member of, and nobody has any delusions that the U.S. is going to become a member now or even anytime soon. Still, all the other most polluting countries, Japan, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, European countries, Russia, all are legally obliged to make a new commitment period starting in 2012 that sets the ecological limits and works down in how they're going to divide and share the burden of cutting their emissions. And that's the most important thing, that we keep that approach, that science-based approach. Science says, here's what you should cut, and then governments, it's up to them to agree how to share that atmospheric carbon space. Without that renewal of the second commitment period, we're afraid that developing countries will be trapped in being captured in making these pledges alongside of the most polluting countries that will then become a new convention that replaces the Kyoto Protocol. Now, at some point we do need something like that, but right now it's a bird in hand is not something you let go just to get two in the bush, because it's the only internationally binding instrument that exists right now. And developing countries don't want to give it up. We shouldn't want to give it up until there's something else as better to replace it. So we're here in Cancun. It's almost midnight. It's Wednesday going on Thursday. And out at the Moon Palace, in a few minutes, there's been a spontaneous stock-taking session that's been called by the president of the COP that ministers will attend. And what that means is that they're going to assess really where we are. But it also means that calling a meeting of ministers at midnight with 48 hours left in the conference means that crunch time is here. And that the plan seems to be, as it often is in international negotiations, especially the World Trade Organization, that they're going to wear down those developing countries and the negotiators, just grind them in for hours and hours of sessions until agreement is made and they knuckle under. So it's that time in Copenhagen where push is going to come to shove. We're going to see the arm twisting back in the capitals of some of the key developing countries. We're probably going to see possibly loans that should be renewed, be reconsidered, with phone calls to prime ministers and then phone calls back to the negotiators here in Cancun, telling them not to block a deal, to be constructive. They don't want to be blamed. The blame game has already started. So I guess the worst case scenario that we're planning for is that the U.S. manages to ram through and run over most of the developing countries, and there are just a handful of countries who are left standing and willing to defend the ecological integrity and the equity principles in the current convention. It's probably going to be Bolivia and Ecuador and Nicaragua and the so-called ALBA countries of the Alliance of Small Island States. Tuvalu is one who really has been speaking strongly and ready to fight till the very end. And then a number of African countries too. The African group is not really clear. A lot of those ministers or even their finance teams have come here looking for money, because that's where people understand now they can get money for their countries and for their people, which is certainly a legitimate need in places like Africa. But those countries also have very difficult challenges ahead in terms of dealing with drought and hurricanes and floods and loss of food production capacity and economic disruptions as a result of climate change. So there is a core set of countries that do want to keep that convention together and are very demanding that a second commitment period has to happen to make greenhouse cuts under the Kyoto Protocol. So that's sort of where it is right now, and we'll just see over the next 48 hours how this transpires.